Amen. All right, welcome back, everyone. So let's just give a brief recap of what we've done so far. So what we've said thus far is we read from Great Controversy 440 and 441. We're still working through that, actually. And we saw that Sister White identifies, and the Bible identifies through the translation, that the word coming out of the earth meant to spring up like a plant. And we saw this as an allusion to the agricultural model, and so we applied that, laid that over the top. And we know from the agricultural model that there's a certain point where the seed is sown and germination happens, which is at the waymark of 9/11, if we call it that way, if I can just overlay our line. And we did that, and we made that 1798, where Sister White is marking this, and we said if this is the point of, if we can do this with the agricultural model, then there must be a time period after, which marks the full progress of the plant, but there must be a time period before as well, where you have the plowing and the preparation of the field, which means you also have a field that is broken at some level, that needs to be corrected. And so we dealt with that briefly, and we identified that with the first angel's message is to dispel the darkness that took place beforehand. And the first angel's message it's given, and then it is developed. And that development takes place there's an increase of knowledge on that message, and finally there's a point of formalization, which we're marking here as 1789 with the Constitution. The message came, we're saying, in 1776, and then and then you come to the point of establishment, you could say it that way. And when you come to the line, when you look at this with the United States, the problem that needs to be dealt with, or the darkness, is the European influence. It's the European connection. And we identified that there is a link from Europe to the United States. We made a little chain here, and that chain gets broken in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. And from that point, and the Declaration of Independence lays out ideas that we identified that were radically different. They were the exact opposite of what was taking place here in the darkness. And those principles are only just that at the beginning. They're just an idea, and through an increase of knowledge on those ideals, they come to a point to where those things get formalized into the Constitution, or into a Constitution, and an organization begins of that. I guess, what's the right way of saying that? There's structure now to those principles. And that Constitution is the thing that becomes the source of strength and the test for the remainder of its time period. And there's going to be a progressive increase of knowledge that goes from the beginning of this history all the way to the end, just like in our reform line. If you were to overlay the time of the end, from the time of the end all the way to the end of the line, there's an increase of knowledge. We don't mark it that way, but technically this increase of knowledge just continues. And we identified that when you see that increase of knowledge, what it tells you is that the information at the end must be greater than that of the beginning. And we said that our information base and our understanding of the Constitution and the principles, the fundamental principles that are enshrined therein, should be greater than that of the Founding Fathers who established the document itself. We should understand that in a deeper way, it's a big ask, if I can say it that way. It's a big calling, or a high calling. And we identified that this also, what you see here, we also said that when you're looking at this line, there's almost a contradiction, because the United States at one level is being destroyed. And by the time you get to the Sunday Law, the Constitution is null and void. But we're saying something about the Constitution is at its finest moment, if you can say it that way. And we use the line of Adventism to illustrate that principle, that Adventism as a whole is going to get destroyed as an institution, but a remnant comes out of Adventism, and that is the crown jewel of that system. And so I would suggest the same thing takes place here with the Sunday law, and I guess the easiest way to say that is it's the same people. The same people who are coming out of Adventism at this point are also coming out of this constitutional, or coming out of the United States, and they have a correct understanding of the religious aspect, that being of Adventist theology and of prophecy, but they also have a correct understanding and a developed understanding of the principles as a within their civic duty, if I can say it that way, the civil side. And so they have a correct understanding of the church, and they have a correct understanding of the state. And I'm not saying church and state, just saying those two aspects. And what else did we say? And then we dealt with, now we jumped into Revelation 13. And we're talking about Revelation 13, and we're doing a little bit of an exercise in how to read properly, and how we come to these understandings just from the chapters and the verses that we're already in. And we are developing a narrative for Revelation 13, or we had developed one in our last class. And we said that, does somebody want to give me the summary overview of Revelation 13? What narrative is it telling us?
The lamb is the prey, and the conglomerate beast is a predator beast, and it's the lamb or the prey that is overcome by the predator.
Amen. So you have these two beasts. You have the prey, the United States. You have the predator, which is the composite beast made up of all these other ones, the papacy. And these two, and it tells the story of the interaction between these two beasts. And what it really is showing is the corruption of the second beast. And it goes back to going back to the first beast. It's going to pay homage to it. And we ended with this question. And the question is, what is the problem with a lamb that speaks like a dragon? What's the problem with that lamb? What's the problem with that beast? Yep.
A lamb doesn't normally speak like a dragon, so it's not within its character to be a dragon.
Amen. So there's a contradiction here. You can't be a lamb and a dragon at the same time. Something's wrong about that. They're opposite symbols. Because if you expand the context of what we're looking at, if you bring Revelation 12 into it, Revelation 12 is the story of the dragon, and you can see from the very beginning of the dragon in Revelation 12 that it's a persecuting power. You know that, just by the nature of what we understand of a dragon. And then that carries over into Revelation 13, and we read in verse 2 that the dragon being spoken of here is the dragon from Revelation 12, gives this composite beast its authority. So the dragon from Revelation 12 is being brought into this, and we know it's a persecuting power, and it gives its power to this beast here, the first beast, but it has some connection with the second beast, and that connection is that this unassuming, nice little lamb-looking beast is contradicting its character by speaking like a dragon. Now my question is, you can't do those things at the same time, if I can say it that way. I mean, you could. Today we would say you could. I mean, in a moral level, maybe you could, and that we just call that hypocrisy. But we have no reason to believe that this animal is hypocritical, at least from its conception. And we know as we read, at least we're reading in the quote that we're looking at, is that this is representing a transition, that it's gonna contradict its character by speaking as a dragon at the end of its life. And so let's go back to Great Controversy 440 and 441. Does anyone have any questions about Revelation 13 and how we've dealt with that? Does it make sense? Is that a hand? Yep.
Because we see this transition between two beasts, so to speak, can we link it with Revelation 17 and the change of the head?
You're saying In the contradiction of his character?
Yeah, can we see that?
It's a good question. That's we know that when the United States does speak as a dragon, it is speaking as a dragon as the seventh kingdom. So there might be something to that. I'd have to think about the implications of that, but I see the logic that you're using. That's interesting. Anyone else? Yep.
Not hypocritical, he said, apparently. But I'm sort of equating it with like a sheep in wolf's clothing. You know,
Okay.
lying, deceptive, misrepresenting its opposite to its character. But its character has changed. It's changed into
The character has changed.
the dragon.
Okay.
So not hypocritical.
Well, I think I think I see your point, but yes, we know that the character changes, but if you just take it in its isolation, there are two opposite symbols being applied to the same animal, the same beast. And that's why I'm saying hypocrisy, because you look like a lamb. When I look at you from the external, you have these lamb horns, which is the lamb thing on this beast. You have these lamb horns, and then we say, okay, you look like a lamb, but then it speaks something, and you say, whoa, you're acting like a dragon, you're speaking like a dragon. So there's a problem, a conflict between its profession and what it looks like, or what its profession and its action.
So are you saying it is hypocritical or it isn't?
I think it is hypocritical, but I know what you're saying, that the character does change. I get that. But if you look at it in the context of the whole, it becomes hypocritical.
Sorry, I thought
Yeah.
you were saying that.
Oh, no, that's my bad. Sorry if I wasn't explaining that well. Yes?
For me, it's not as much hypocritical as being two things at once as being two separate things, or a dispensational. It's a lamb dispensation and a dragon speaking, a lamb speaking like a dragon's dispensation. So there's the lamb speaking like a lamb, for the original Constitution and all the first part. The lamb is speaking like a lamb, and then it speaks like a dragon. So it's a different dispensation.
Okay.
Character change.
All right. Anyone else?
Speaking always indicates legislation.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, the transition.
Okay, so let's jump back into the quote. Just as GC 440 and 441. I think this is actually 441 at this point. And I'll just start that paragraph over. We've already read a little bit of it. And he had two horns like a lamb, and the lamb-like horns indicate youth, innocence, and gentleness, fitly representing the character of the United States when presented to the prophet as coming up in 1798. So we have the lamb, it's lamb-like in 1798. It's these characteristics. The Christian exiles who fled to America sought asylum from royal oppression and priestly intolerance, and they determined to establish a government upon the broad foundation of civil and religious liberty. So it would be good if everyone has this paragraph in front of you, as many as can, because I want to break it. I want to look at some of the things that Sister White does in here. So right there in that sentence, she says, the Christian exiles who first fled to America sought an asylum from religious oppression, royal oppression and priestly intolerance, and they determined to establish a government upon the broad foundation of civil and religious liberty. So what has she just done in that sentence?
Church and state.
Church and state. But she gives you both sides of church and state. She says you have the bad side of church and state, which is royal oppression, which is the civil, and priestly intolerance, which is the church. And then she says the opposite of that, the thing that they're trying to fix, or the way they're going to fix it is by introducing civil and religious liberty. So she gives you both sides, the church side and the state side. There's a problem with both of them. See that? And then here she's going to bring us, and Sister White's going to do something that I said was true, but she's going to actually give us a nice witness to it. She's going to connect the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution. She's going to bring them together. So let's continue reading. The Declaration of Independence sets forth the great truth that all men are created equal and endowed with the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the Constitution guarantees to the people the right of self-government, providing that representatives elected by the popular vote shall enact and administer the laws. Freedom of religion, freedom of religious faith was also guaranteed. Every man being permitted to worship God according to the dictates of his conscience. So notice there, she's reiterating, she's repeating, enlarging on that concept. She says the right to self-governance and governing civilly, but then she also says the freedom of religion. And then she's going to say this to add to that. To summarize again, she actually does the same comparison, the same repeat and enlarge 3 times now. Then she says republicanism and Protestantism became the fundamental principles of the nation. These principles are the secret of its power and prosperity. The oppression and downtrodden throughout Christendom have turned to this land with interest and hope. Millions have sought its shores, and the United States has risen to a place among the most powerful nations of the earth. So she identifies the problem. The problem is civil, royal oppression, and religious priestly intolerance. And then she says, to solve that, they're going to enact civil and religious liberty. And then to give the same aspects again, she says self-government and freedom of religion. And then she again gives the same aspect, but just from using different words. She says republicanism and Protestantism. So, can someone define for me republicanism and Protestantism? How would you do that? With what we just did, how would you answer that question?
A country without a king, and a country without...
Using the paragraph, how would we do that?
No.
Republicanism is free from royal oppression, has self-governance, and Protestantism is free from priestly intolerance and has freedom of religious faith.
Amen. That's exactly it. So if we were to draw it, and we're not going to just for sake of time, she tells you the problem, and then she just gives you a repeat and enlarge several times of the same thing. So republicanism, as my sister said, would be civil liberty. It would be self-governance. And Protestantism is religious liberty and freedom of religious faith, guaranteed by the Constitution. So you can see she defines her terms, so to speak, there. Okay. Now the problem with this paragraph, and I think it's a problem for Adventism, and it may be a problem for all of us here, but what is the problem with republicanism and Protestantism? What's the problem with that phrase? Let me say it this way. Let me ask the question better. What is the problem with the United States, with Sister White saying that the United States power is Protestantism and republicanism? What's the problem with that phrase? What? Well,
it's a contradiction of the First Amendment.
Okay, explain that. Explain the contradiction.
The First Amendment allows freedom of all religions, not just Protestant.
Okay.
We have to remember that.
Amen. So we have the First Amendment in the United States is the Establishment Act, or clause, I guess, and it doesn't allow the government to choose a faith. But Sister White is saying here that the secret to the success of the United States is the fact that it's a Protestant and Republican. It's Protestant and Republican, and those are the secret to its power. So there seems to be a contradiction, right? Sister White is saying, okay, we're Republicans and we're Protestant, but the Constitution says, and what she just said in her own paragraph is the separation of church and state. But it seems like she's endorsing a religion for the United States. Do you see the verbiage, the way you read it like that?
Yeah, I think you can still accept that if it were Catholics and Republicanism, they wouldn't have the power that it has.
Okay.
It's because they're Protestant. She's identifying Protestantism as being one of the factors that goes into giving the United States its power.
So
As well as the civil side.
so she's saying that Protestantism and Republicanism are enshrined in the Constitution. So,
But a true Protestant would stand up for God's law, which is not pushing their own faith. So we have to look at the Bible, and God never pushes anything on anyone. So a true Protestant would obey the Bible.
so is this an endorsement of Protestantism?
It is in the true sense if you have true Protestants, but we
Well-
don't have true Protestants.
Okay, let me ask. Yep.
Well, I was just gonna add to Bruce's.
So he said, let me repeat his thing for the camera. I'm going to try to repeat them because otherwise it's not going to make sense to anyone watching. My brother said, can you repeat that for me again so I can repeat it?
Well, if you're
A true Protestant.
if you're a true Protestant, you would obey the laws of God.
If you're a true Protestant, you would obey the laws of God.
And the laws of God would not push anyone to any particular religious faith. God calls us, he doesn't push us.
Okay, and God's
God
law,
calls us, he doesn't push us.
God's law, God doesn't push us, he calls us, and so
We
it's
should give people the right to be wrong.
we give people the right to be wrong. My sister?
Absolutely.
I was just going to add to what Bruce was just saying. The definitions have changed. Republicanism in modern day vernacular would relate to the Republican Party.
Mm-hmm.
Protestantism, according to a few people in the Sunday keeping world, is dead. You know, so that the terms have changed definition in a sense.
Okay, there's a definitional problem.
Definitional problem from the days of the Constitution being formed.
Okay.
And
My sister?
I'm just wondering how much of it might have to do with the original point of when a bunch of the leaders from Europe became Protestants. It was basically to free themselves, like, if you're a Protestant, you can keep your wealth that you've accumulated and earned over time, right? If you were not a Protestant, it had to be given back. The church claimed it when you died. So when she's saying here, republicanism and Protestantism became the fundamental principle. With being a Protestant, you're not under this restriction. You have some freedom with what you do, right? Your freedom to choose,
Okay.
right? And she said, these became the secret power. It's secret power and prosperity. So with republicanism, with being a Protestant, wealth was then passed on to generation. So in that, it gave a certain freedom, but then freedom with wealth, but also freedom to choose your destiny without it being imposed on you.
Okay.
At least that's what I think I understand her to be.
Okay. My sister?
I kind of was thinking of originally when Protestantism started out, it was starting out as a lamb, but then Protestantism has changed into the dragon. It's no longer pure.
So Protestantism has morphed,
Yes.
you're saying? Okay. All right. One more?
In 1798, Protestantism was God's church. There wasn't another church. That was God's church in 1798. So if along the way Protestantism falls, the secret of the power of the United States has fallen, and if republicanism falls, then both of its secret powers are gone and the country will fall. So those aspects, probably I would say the majority at the time of 1798 of the population were Protestant, and they were the majority. And the Constitution protects it so that in the future, when they're a minority, they would still be protected by that Constitution, because the Constitution protects the minority from the majority.
Okay. So before I take Sister Tessa's comment, you all have a fundamental problem in your logic, and I'll come back to it in a second. I'll just say it before we go to Sister Tess. You're all making the United States a Christian nation. And what I'm not saying you mean to do it, but the logic is that you're saying that the Constitution establishes Protestantism as its faith. I know you don't mean to say that, but that's actually what ends up happening if you read this like that. You say that the United States is a Protestant nation. Sister Tess? Is that where you're going to say that? Oh, sorry. Sorry. We're on the same page there then. Sister?
Liberty is the basic principle here, though, right? Freedom. And religious under Protestant, not under Protestantism. Protestantism, as Bruce was saying, upholds freedom of conscience. And
Protestantism upholds freedom of conscience. Sorry, I'm just repeating.
And republicanism upholds freedom of conscience.
And republicanism upholds freedom of conscience.
It upholds self-government.
Self-governance.
Upholds us being responsible for ourselves and accountable for ourselves, our own actions.
Okay. Individual responsibility.
Individual responsibility.
Okay.
And so those were undermined as the corruptions crept in.
Okay. So what I want to suggest is that Protestantism here does not mean Protestant as you're thinking about it, as an establishment of religion. Let me bring us back to can somebody explain for us what's the definition of Protestantism?
Protester against Rome.
The protest of Rome. Who were the first people to protest Rome?
Luther and the princes. They became
The
Protestant
princes.
after the princes.
Who are the princes?
Of Germany.
German what? German leaders. What kind of leaders? Civil leaders. Protestantism is born out of a civil action. It's the idea that the church was trying to tell the state what to do, and the state said, "You're not going to tell us what to do anymore. We're not listening." The princes came together. They're not religious, and they're not priests. They're not anything like that. These princes, civil leaders, came together and they said, "We're not going to do this anymore," and they protested Rome, and that's where the name Protestant comes from. Is the Diet of Spires, but the princes are protesting. And so what I want us to see is that the foundation of the term Protestantism has nothing to do with being a Protestant faith. It has nothing to do with that. It actually just means to protest Rome telling the civil power what to do. That's where the name comes from. And so here, when we come to this paragraph, it's not the identification of anything to do with Christianity. It's the identification of Protestantism as protesting the combination of church and state. That the church dictates anything to the state, and you can see that in the original example of where the name comes from. And so what we see here is republicanism is the idea of self-governance, is the idea of the individual, and Protestantism is representing the combination of church and state and attacking that. Yep.
And if I could add, in matters of conscience, the majority has no power.
In matter of conscience, the majority has no power.
That's their statement.
Okay. Yeah. And so
it is true.
it is, yes, that's true. And so that's important for us to note, because I'm sure, I'm positive that eventually, at some time in the future, this quote will be used against God's people. I'm sure Adventism will use this quote to identify, for whatever reason, that the events that are taking place in the United States are good. That's my prediction, is that this quotation will be used against us. Because really, what this quotation does is it makes the United States a secular government. And that's important to see, is that the United States is not a Christian nation. It's not established on any faith. Now the problem that everyone is going to have with that is the idea that the individuals or some of the principles, or even, you can even say all the principles found in the Constitution you can't separate them from the fact that these were Protestant individuals. And there's a conversation to be had about that, the undergirding of the ideas that led them to where they are. But there's nothing here or nothing in the Constitution that tells you anything about religion, other than that it just has no place here. And I can say it in this way. When you come to the Constitution, when you come to the civil side of government, or the civil side of a nation, you check your religion at the door. And that's sort of a hard thing to say, but it's the truth of the matter, is you have to do that. You can't bring it with you.
That's what happened to John F. Kennedy. He had to write a statement, went on TV that he would not vote his church, but vote his conscience
Yeah.
on the Constitution. So, and he had to do that at that time.
He was our
First Catholic president,
First Catholic.
JFK. Okay. Does that make sense? Don't mean to belabor that point, but I think it's a really important point as moving forward, as you're dealing with the Constitution, Brother Theodore.
I just have a question.
Question.
The question has to do with the idea that the horns are churchcraft and statecraft. How would you address that in this context?
I don't think they are. I mean, my knee-jerk reaction would be to say that I don't think they are churchcraft and statecraft. The question is, for the camera, are the two horns of Revelation 13:11 representing churchcraft and statecraft?
Or wouldn't it represent, my understanding is that they're separated.
You're saying the two horns aren't like two horns together?
Yeah, they're separate. Churchcraft and statecraft are separate. That's the way I always understood it.
Okay. I think there's more to Protestantism as a religion when it comes into the, as I was saying, the undergirding of this history, in the ways in which they were led to move and the ideas that they're going to espouse and place into the Constitution. I don't think you can make the United States without being a Protestant. I don't think they would have come to the same conclusions, let me say it that way, at the time if they weren't Protestant. So I mean, there is an influence there. There's something to that. But that's very different than saying the United States is endorsing Protestantism, or that it establishes any religion. Yep.
Maybe you could say that it was founded on Protestant principles. The principles that underlie the Protestant religion were the principles they used to develop the Constitution.
All right. Yep.
I'm wondering about the coin, "In God We Trust."
In God we trust. And what's your question with "In God we trust" on the coin?
Isn't that, I don't know, it's just, what is that saying? Is it saying that they've chosen religion or not?
What do you think?
I think it does.
You think it does? So the question is, what do we do with a coin that says "In God we trust," or money that says "In God we trust"? And the question Sister Tiffany has is that espousing a religion? Is that establishing a religion by saying "In God we trust," or choosing religion? And she says she thinks it does. I think so too. I think it absolutely does. What?
I think it does
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
Definitely.
We're going to talk about that history, and that history is really interesting. And just to talk about it for a moment, just because you brought it up, it's a really interesting little tidbit about it, is that all of those things took place in the 1950s. By all those things, we haven't clarified what all of them are. The changing of the Pledge of Allegiance, or the Pledge of Allegiance, "In God We Trust," and the money. The changing of the national motto to "In God We Trust," and I'm missing something. There's at least, well,
Taking the Bibles out of the schools.
Or putting the
that's a little bit later.
trust into the schools. Putting "In God We Trust" into the schools.
They place the motto everywhere, making the Ten Commandments statues and placing them in front of legislative bodies in this time period after the 1950s. They do a lot of things, a lot of pushes, but what's really interesting about the history, and again, we'll come back to all these individual things, and this sort of has nothing to do with your point, but it's just interesting, is that within a short span of time, they come to these conclusions that we're going to change the money, change this, change the motto, add these placards everywhere. And only a couple years later, maybe 2 or 3 years later, they start having court cases about some of those things that they've done. And there's question of school prayer and those kind of things. And what everyone goes back to who says that we are a Christian nation, is they say, look, we changed the money. Our money is this. Our motto is that. And they start pointing back to these things. And it's almost, I don't know how to explain it, but it's a little bit of a circular argument because they changed those only like a couple years before. It's not like they changed those things all the way back here. It was only a year or two before, and they're saying, look, we did this, so we must be a Christian nation. It's just an interesting thing that's sort of a circular logic.
I thought the coins were changed with or that was engraved on the coins in 1765.
1765.
1865.
1865.
End of the Civil War, it was put on the coin.
It was put on the 3-cent coin in 1865. I think 1860, I think it's 5. It was put on the 3-cent coin. Yes, they did start that process pretty early, but it becomes a bigger thing as they go forward. They actually had a Christian amendment at that time too. So yes, those things, just to get back onto topic, those things are an endorsement of religion. Do you have any other question on that? Okay. Yeah, okay. So, moving forward. One thing I just want to say about that in our conversation we just had about Protestantism and republicanism, I don't know if you see it, I don't know if I explained it well enough, or maybe we just haven't talked about it long enough at this point, but it's a very tricky conversation. And the answer is of the utmost importance because either you make the United States a Christian nation or you don't. And it's very easy to, by accidentally, trap yourself into a logic to where you've made the United States a Christian nation by accident. And you just got to be careful of that when you're thinking about this. So that problem is there. Okay, so moving forward. So I want to read a quotation from Prophets and Kings, but before I do, I want to just bring us back to here. So the problem in Europe, is it a European problem? Maybe a bad question, but we'll see what answers we get. Is it a European-only problem? No. It's a worldwide problem. And one thing I want us to see is that the answer to the problem starts in the United States, but one of the things that we're going to see, and it's even now we see it with the idea of with two streams of information, that it's not a localized problem. It's a problem of the mind, and it's a problem that goes global. It's a global issue that affects everyone. And so the European mind was a global problem, and the United States was a local solution that was going to try to fix the problem. And they began to fix the problem, or they did fix the problem till the Sunday Law. So my question, how do I say this, or let me just say it, is what started off in the United States was supposed to go to the world. Do we understand that? Or are we okay with that? So, and it did. It really did. And what you see take place is from this point forward, from the 1780s, when's the beginning of the French Revolution? 1780 what? 89, that's what it is. 1789. Oh yeah, the Constitution. The beginning of the Constitution, yeah, is in 1789. And they're going to go for 10 years. So at the exact same moment that this is taking place in the United States, you have a similar situation taking place in France, where France almost has the identical constitution, almost, very similar at least, and they're trying to do the same thing. They're trying to overthrow the European problem. They're trying to fix that. What's the problem with France? Well, maybe we're not going to answer it in this moment, but there's a distinction between France and the United States because they're trying to do the same thing, and they have the same tools to do the thing to some degree. And what I mean by tools is they have the same constitution to some degree, but one brings you to freedom, in 1798 into the United States and all of that, but the other one takes you to Napoleon. So there's a problem. They start off the same way, but they end in actually opposite locations. And I think it's a conversation worth having, and we're not going to have it in this moment. but part of the reason was the influences of the people, I think. We can come back to that at some point. But what I want us to see is that at the same time this is taking place in the United States, that the idea of freedom that was established here begins to sweep across the world. And many people look to the United States in that time as, we want to do what the United States did and overthrow our masters, to overthrow Britain and India, to overthrow, the French or the Dutch or the colonial powers, and institute the same thing. And there's varying successes around the world. But my point, what I want us to see, is that idea that started in the United States, the goal of what God was trying to do was not to isolate that truth and to make an isolated place of freedom, but was to spread freedom around the world. Now, I don't mean that to say, like, we spread freedom around the world today in the United States with bullets, that kind of thing. It was meant to be a spreading of freedom in the mind, as by example and precept, so to speak. So I want to read a quote from Prophets and Kings. This is PK 708. PK 708. Through the message, and what I want to do here, sorry, let me just preface this, is I want to illustrate, I want to see how ancient Israel fell into a very particular trap. And I want to suggest that the United States has fallen into that same trap to some degree. And I'll try to explain that. Through the messages such as those borne by Malachi, the last of the Old Testament prophets, as well as through oppression from heathen foes, the Israelites finally learned the lesson that true prosperity depends upon obedience to the law of God. But with many of the people, obedience was not the outflow of faith and love. Their motives were selfish. Outward service was rendered as a meaning of attaining to national greatness. Let me read that again. The motives were selfish. The outward service was rendered as a means of attaining to national greatness. The chosen people did not become the light of the world, but shut themselves away from the world as a safeguard against being seduced into idolatry. So one of the problems, and we'll talk about this, hopefully we'll talk about this if we get the time, is the United States at one point tries to close itself off from the rest of the world. It depends what president you're under and exactly how they want to characterize that, but this is the idea of isolationism, and which took place during I think this is before World War I, I believe, is when that concept was really trying to be pushed. And it was something they struggled with, and that's part of the reason why it was hard for the United States to get involved in World War I and World War II, is because of this concept. But what I want us to see here is that Israel, the internal, was supposed to be the light of the world, and I'm saying the United States is also supposed to fall into that same category. They're supposed to give something. The Israelites had spiritual truth. The United States here has civil freedom, civil truth. Okay. And, okay, I'm just going to stop with that one actually. I won't read the rest of it for time. But all I wanted to pick up from that quote is that there's in the external, God's people, in the external, the United States should be giving a message of freedom to the world. And internally, during the same period of time, God's church should be giving a message of freedom as well, or of spiritual freedom. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears just a little bit, and I'm going to read a fair bit, and I'm sorry I'm going to do this, but I think it's really important because it's going to answer a lot of our questions. So part of what I want to do is I'm going to read from A.T. Jones. This document is called Appeal from the U.S. Supreme Court Decision Making This a Christian Nation, in quotes. And just to give you a little bit of backstory on what we're going to read, A.T. Jones is addressing a Supreme Court decision based upon a particular problem that was going on in the United States at the time. And the part of the problem was about, it was an immigration problem to some extent. It was an immigration problem, importing workers. And the problem was that at the time there were laws that said you can't bring in hired work from outside the United States if it takes the job away from a laborer at the time, a U.S. laborer. Maybe I'm not saying that well. So if you have an American citizen who could take the same job, you have to give it to the U.S. citizen and you can't give it to a foreigner and bring them in. Part of the reason they wanted to do this was because you had a lot of unskilled labor being brought into the United States, and they would pay them a lot less than they were going to for the American counterpart of that same person. Very similar issue that is today in the United States, in a lot of countries actually. And so this is what kind of kicks the problem off. And there's a court case about it, but the specific problem was that a church was hiring a pastor from Europe to come to the United States to do a certain work for them. And there became this controversy over that. And the Supreme Court rules in such a way, and most of it is fine, but they add something about a Christian nation, that we're a Christian nation, into their decision. And A.T. Jones is going to comment on that and he gives a very long explanation of why that's wrong and how they went wrong in that history. And so that's just a little bit of context. But we're not going to read most of it. It's way too long for us to read here. You'd have to sit down and really read it. It's 50, 60 pages. But we're just going to read a couple pages. And what we want to highlight is the understanding that he has of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So one of the things I want to do is I want to look at the Constitution a little bit, just some of it. And we've already looked at the Declaration of Independence a little bit. But A.T. Jones is going to give us an amazing explanation of this time period here and of the problem that they faced in Europe. And so, forgive me for the length of this quotation. And if you have a device that is able to do it, if you type in, I don't actually have a code. What page? What page am I on? You have it? Okay, I'm on the first page. It says a protest right at the bottom of the page. It's an appeal from the U.S. Supreme Court appeal from the U.S. Supreme Court decision making this a Christian nation. Okay. So I'm not going to read that protest because he explains what I just told you to some degree about the decision, but I am going to read this. If you go on to the next page, and it starts with on the reverse side of the Great Seal. So it says this: on the reverse side of the Great Seal of the United States, there is a Latin inscription, Novus Ordem Secularum, meaning a new order of things. This new order of things was designed and accomplished in the American Revolution, which was expressed in two distinct ideas. First, that the government is of the people, and second, that the government is of right, entirely separate from religion. So somebody summarize those two things. Give me two different words for them.
Separation of truth.
So he says there's two ideas. The first idea, so he says on the Great Seal, it says there's a new order. This is a new order of things. So the first thing, before step back a second, the Great Seal of the United States on the reverse side says a new order of things. So, and he's saying the new order of things is accomplished here. So that's significant because we're saying that the process from 1776 to 1789, the process of these principles being established, being first identified, then established in the Constitution, is the overturning of the established order of things. And the established order of things at that time is the European mind. It's the European influence. And so he's saying it gets accomplished here. And he says there are two things. He says the first one is that government is of the people. And second, that government is of right, entirely separate from religion. So give me two words that classify those two phrases, or two sentences. Republicanism and Protestantism. He's using that, without saying those words, he's saying those things. So republicanism, by A.T. Jones' definition, is that government is of the people. And Protestantism, that government is of right entirely separate from religion. So that answers our understanding about the problem of the word Protestantism. He's using the same idea, but he's just framing it in a better way, I would say. Or not a better way, but in a different way that answers to the problem we were stating before. And then he says this. So the new order of things comes with the revolution. These two ideas are but the result of one grand fundamental principle, the chief cornerstone of American institutions. And this is briefly comprehended and nobly expressed in the following words of the Declaration of Independence. So now he's going to tell you what that phrase is, or what the principle is that is the cornerstone of the American institution. And he says it's in the first, you can see it in the Declaration of Independence. And I'm not going to read it, but because we read this already, but he's going to quote from the Declaration the part that says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. I'll read just part of it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then he quotes the rest of that part that we read earlier. And he says this, thus, in 2 sentences was annihilated the despotic doctrine which, springing from the usurped authority of the papacy to sit in the place of God and to set up and pull down kings and to bestow kingdoms and empires at its arbitrary will, had become venerable, it, if not absolutely hollowed, by the precedence of 1,000 years. He's talking about the 1260. The doctrine, I butchered that because of the problem. He writes it a little bit weird, but he's saying this. I'll read that again without cutting into it. And to bestow kingdoms and empires at its arbitrary will had become venerable, if not absolutely hallowed, by the precedent of 1,000 years. The doctrine of divine right of rulers. And in the place of the old false and despotic theory of the sovereignty of the government, in the subjugation of the people, there was declared to all nations and for all time. So again, you can see it's a global issue that he's talking about now. There was a declaration to all nations and for all time the self-evident truth. And he's quoting from the Declaration there. The subjugation of the government and the sovereignty of the people. So what has he just done there? It's switched. So the papacy was saying the doctrine of the divine right of rulers, which is monarchies and kings. He's saying that they have a divine right to be your ruler. And he's saying that all gets overturned, and the self-evident truth that the founders realized was the principle of not that they have divine rule, but in the exact opposite, the subjugation of the government and the sovereignty of the people. So the government is now subordinate to the people. This self-evident and unalterable truth of the supremacy of the rights of the people and the government was set forth as the fundamental principle of the government of the United States when the National Constitution was formed. For the preamble to the document announces that we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So what has just happened? The United States is founded not on the fact that the United States has power in and of itself to be a nation, but the exact opposite, that the people found the government, and they say, we give you the power to be a government. It's the exact opposite of what has always taken place for the 1260 years. And so the idea of the rights of the people is the idea that is enshrined in the Constitution there. And this truth became an established and everlasting fixture of this government. And when the 9th and 10th Amendment were adopted for the Article 4 for Article 9 of the amendments says, so now he's going to quote from the 9th and 10th Amendment of the Constitution. Now the 9th and 10th Amendment, for those who don't know, are part of what section of the United States Constitution? The 9th and 10th Amendment. Does anyone know? It's the Bill of Rights. So, does anyone know what the Bill of Rights are? Anyone? Okay. So the Bill of Rights, this is important. It's important because it will later become important in parts of our conversation. I was going to say our Constitution, of our conversation, is the Bill of Rights were placed into, I got to step back one more. So the Constitution says all the things it says. And one of the things that it adds is a means by which you can change the Constitution or amend it or add things to it. And this is the amendment system. Are we all familiar with that? The amendment system? The idea of it? That you can add things to the Constitution? Yes? And so there's an amendment system. And the first thing they amend, the first thing they do is they add something called the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. And the reason this is important is because at the time, there's a problem, there's a battle between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The Federalists are the people who want big government, and the Anti-Federalists are the people who want small government. And they have this battle that takes place. And we're going to probably talk about that at some point, but it was placed in there as a compromise to some degree for the Anti-Federalists to appease them because they felt that the Constitution didn't explain their rights well enough as individuals, and they wanted it to be explicitly mentioned that they had certain rights. And these two rights, the 9th and 10th Amendment, make up the last two of the Bill of Rights. So they're important. They're part of more of a special part of the Constitution. And they say this. And so they're the last two thoughts of the Bill of Rights. And it says this. The 9th Amendment says this. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So what I want us to pick up, there's a couple things. One is, what is the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights? Which rights? We talked about this a little earlier. Which rights are enumerated? The what?
Civil.
Not what kind of rights, but I mean what, not civil or religious, I don't mean it that way, but what kind of rights are these? Yes, these are the rights you can't take away, and they're the rights that you can't give away. So those are the rights that are being talked about. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights, so you have certain rights that are explicitly stated in here, shall not be construed to deny or disparage other what? Other rights. Other rights that aren't enumerated in the Constitution, and those are retained by the people, it says. Now, A.T. Jones is quoting this because he says, he's identifying here that the sovereignty of the individual or of the people is greater than greater than the power of the Constitution. He's saying there's rights that the government can't touch, even if you can't use any right in the Constitution to affect my other rights. And then it says this, which goes on to say that the power not delegated. Now, if I delegate something, what does that mean? I turn it over. So it's saying the power not delegated to the United States by this Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So it's saying, again, it's the idea of the sovereignty of the people, that the Constitution and the government of the United States isn't getting its power from the fact that it just has its own self-evident power. It's getting its power because we delegated that. And if I can say it this way, we all come together and we say, we're going to form a government right now. But we're going to form this government on the basis that everyone here is sovereign and that you have certain rights that I can't touch, nor can you give away. And those have to be always protected. And so we all come together and we say that, and we say, okay, we'll say Tabo is the symbol of our government. We say, okay, Tabo, you can have this authority over us, and we're all going to play by this social rule, this social contract. But there's certain things you can't do. And those things that you can't do is you can't step on our inalienable rights or unalienable rights. And so I know I'm belating this point, but what you need to see here is that the sovereignty comes from the individual. And this is immensely important when we start looking into this history, and as we go even further into our time today, there's always the question is always about, how do I say that? Maybe not always about, let me say it. There's always an underlying principle that touches what's being said here about the rights of the individual versus not the rights of the individual. And I'm saying that in a poor way, but it's something that becomes a problem all throughout the history of the United States. And this principle needs to be remembered through that. And a lot of people haven't remembered that. Okay, so he quoted the 9th, he quoted the 10th to show that it's the people who give them the right. And then he says this. Now he's going to talk about religious freedom here for a moment. It is, however, the right of the people with respect to religion with which we have here particularly to deal, as religion is the subject of the Supreme Court decision in the Act of Congress that are to be noticed. The right of the people of the United States to be religious or not religious, each one for himself alone, without any notice or interference of the government in any way, is a natural, a constitutional, and a divine right. So he's now placing that in that framework. So again, the reason we're going through this is to identify the differences. And we're going to do this in another way later, but we're identifying the differences from this period of time here, before 1776, and this period of time after 1776, where the new order comes in, the new order of things, as it says. And one of these is the fact that you have, where before it was the government that had the power, and it was the people who were subordinate. Now it's been turned around. The people have the power and the government is subordinate. And now he's saying your religious affiliation, your idea to be religious or not religious is a constitutional and a divine right. It's a natural right. Okay. So I'm going to skip some of that. There's some of these that I think we'll come back to when we start talking about the religious aspect, but I want to skip some of those. I sort of want to keep it in a broader sense. Let me just go a little bit further. Okay, this is where I want to be. So if you go to page, for those who are looking, it's on page 11, 10 or 11, I'm not sure.
What is it we're looking under?
Sorry.
You have A.T. Jones in your side of
So if you look, A.T. Jones,
Okay.
it's under A.T. Jones, and if you type in appeal from the U.S. Supreme Court decision making this a Christian nation, that's the title of what he's writing about. And I'm reading from that.
You ever look at all the books that A.T. Jones off to the side?
Okay.
So I want to end with this point. And this is an amazing point because they identify something that I think is particularly important for us today as we come to the end of this controversy. So I need to give you just a little bit of backstory, and to do that, I need to tell you this. So I'm skipping a bunch of this, and he gives a little bit of a story, so I'm going to try to tell you that story without having to read all of it. It's very wordy. Where do I start? So a law is passed on December 6th, 1776. No, that's not the one I'm looking for. Sorry. That's the wrong one. Effort establishment. Okay. I'll just say it this way without getting into the details of it. They want to make a law, and it's it's before the Constitution. It's before we get here. It's in this time period a little bit before. And what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to make a law that says we can support pastors with money. Not any money, with tax money, with federal money, or not federal money, state money. And so they want to establish, basically, what that's going to do is it's going to establish a religion, because what they're going to do is they're going to focus on the Episcopal Church. There's a certain church that they're going to give money to to support their pastors. Sort of like a subsidy to some degree. And what happens is that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are going to oppose this bill. And this is I think this is in Virginia, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong. Yes, it's in Virginia. And a bill establishing a provision for teachers of the Christian religion. That's what it is, sorry. And there's a divide over it. And one thing in Thomas Jefferson and Madison and James Madison are going to fight against this, and they're going to be the opposition. Now, one thing we're going to talk about later, and and we're going to just first mention it here, is the idea in the United States of states. Now, it's not really complicated, but in the United States, you have the federal government, as we all know. You have the U.S. government, it's the federal government. And under the federal government, you have a bunch of state powers. You have all 50 states. Now you have 50 states, but at that time it was obviously different. And the states have governments within themselves. And there's always friction, and always has been friction between the government and that friction and the distinctions between state law and federal law are really important when we talk about the Constitution when we come to slavery. It becomes important when we talk about a lot of issues, but slavery is the biggest issue I think we're going to look at that identifies the issue with federal law and state law. And so I just want to introduce that at this point here. One, there's no government yet, but all these states are going to have their own internal struggles about certain things, and this is where some of the religious problems begin in Virginia. And so James Madison and Thomas Jefferson are going to be the opposition. They're going to fight against this, and they're going to write this long thing, and we're not going to read all of it. I just want to read part of it. Okay. And we will just read one section of it, and it's this. Okay. It's number 3 if you're looking at it. And it's on page 10 or 11. It says number 3 next to it. Because it is proper to take alarm at the first... You really need to pay attention to the language. Because it is proper to take alarm at the first experiment upon our liberties. So what does that mean? Can somebody explain that to me? I'll read it again. Because it is proper to take alarm at the first experiment upon our liberties. What does that mean? A challenge. The experiment means the first challenge to our liberties. Because it is proper to take alarm at the first challenge or experiment upon our liberties. We hold this prudent jealousy to be the first duty of citizens and one of the noblest characteristics of the late revolution. So they're saying we literally just went through this history to where our ideals were challenged, our rights were challenged, and we took offense to that, and we pounced, so to speak. We got into action. And he's saying that is one of the noblest and first duties of the citizen, is to realize when their freedom or their liberties are being challenged. And he says this: the free men of America did not wait till usurped power had strengthened itself by exercise and entangled itself in precedents. Do we understand that? Let me read that one more time. The free men of America, he's talking about during the Revolutionary War. The free men of America did not wait till usurped power had strengthened itself by exercise and entangled itself in precedents. And so when Sister Tiffany was talking about in God we trust, those are what I would say are precedents. And we let ourselves get entangled in how does he say it? Entangled in precedents. And the entangled in, so in a court, everyone understand what a precedent is? Do we understand that concept? Okay. When you not just win a case, but when you what? When you set a standard of how we're going to deal with this kind of case, if it's a murder case or whatever, and that becomes precedent, and there's always sort of an understood rule that you're not supposed to go against precedent as much as possible if it's a good precedent. And so to establish a normative action by the courts. So he's saying here that the founders didn't wait till Britain entangled itself in these precedents of usurping our power, and we struck before it happened. But I'm saying things like In God We Trust are precedents that have been set for over 50 years. Well, what is that, 60 years? Something like that? 60, 70 years back. And now we're at the point to where those things are now enshrined into a generation of people, to the point to where many people never knew when the idea of In God We Trust came into history. They just take it that we've always had it from the beginning, the conception of the Constitution. It's always been In God We Trust. And so those things, that's the problem they're identifying there. And then he says this, they saw all the consequence in the principle, and they avoided the consequence by denying the principle. That's, in this whole document, that's the nicest phrase I've ever read. It's really nice. Let me read it one more time. They saw the consequence in the principle, and they avoided the consequence by denying the principle. That is Christianity at some level right there. That is. Sister White would endorse that statement, a statement like that. That is reasoning from cause to effect. Even actually what it is, it's even before cause to effect, because there's no effect yet. It's actually saying we see a potential cause, and we extrapolate the principle, or we see the principle and we see where that consequence leads, and we don't want to go there. And they say we deny the principle, thus we never get to that point. And this is a problem that we've had in the United States today, is that, and that we have as individuals, I think, is we don't understand I think humans have this problem, is that we don't often understand the consequence of a principle, and we don't understand where it leads.
And they vote policy instead of principle.
And then there's the whole problem of policy and principle.
Yeah.
Could you reread it, please?
Yes. They saw all the consequence in the principle, and they avoided the consequence by denying the principle. So, in this, again, this is an important phrase. We reserve this. It has implications in a lot of different ways, but one of them is the idea of understanding principles and understanding the effect that principles have. And there's a lot we could say about that. We just don't have the time. And so I'm going to end with just this little bit here. We reserve this lesson too much. We revere this lesson too much. I'm reading that wrong. We revere this lesson too much soon to forget it. Who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion to all other religions may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians in exclusion of all other sects? And so this idea of the power of the government to remove a right or to establish a right is something that the founders dealt with, and it's even gonna worm its way. This idea is even gonna worm its way into the idea of slavery, and this is something we'll talk about. But it's the idea that the government can be so strong that it takes away your right, or that it establishes someone else's right instead of yours, if I say it that way. And so you never want government to get to that point to where it has the power to either remove your right or to establish someone else's right, something like that. It's important to see. That same authority which can force a citizen to contribute 3 pence only of his property for the support of one establishment may force him to conform to another establishment in all cases whatsoever. Really nice principle there. And so we're going to stop there for sake of time, and so I want to summarize what we've been talking about. So we went through this earlier in the last presentation, and we looked at Revelation 13. And what we spent most of our time on in this presentation is we've been going through A.T. Jones's his document here about the Supreme Court case and identifying the principles. And what we're trying to see is the principles that he defines as the seal of the U.S. Constitution describes as the new order of things. And the new order of things takes place, as A.T. Jones says, during the Revolution, and it changes everything that was before it. And so again, we're saying that you have the old order and the new order, and the new order is established on two principles, and he describes them as, how does he say it? He describes them as that government is of the people, and that government is of right entirely separate from religion. So it's Protestantism and Republicanism become the new order of things that are written within here. And the principle that undergirds all of that is the idea of the sovereignty of the individual over the state. And so what I want us to see is all these principles that are new are going to find their way into the Constitution and become something that affect everything down the line. And they should be... So we have this idea, let me just finish with this, is at 9/11, what are we supposed to do in terms of the pioneers? This is an old thing, we don't talk about this much anymore. Thank you. That was quick. Yeah, we return to the old paths. So at 9/11, you can mark it there, regardless of where you want to mark it. It doesn't even matter. But we know that we have a duty to return to the old paths and to get back on track where you've gotten off track. And in doing so, we identify that you have to go back to the beginning of Advent history to understand the history in which you live in presently. And once you understand that, once you understand the past, you can now operate and maneuver through the present and the future in a better way. And with all the spiritual implications, if you say it that way. The same thing is true here with the United States Constitution, is that for us to navigate the political world and to navigate the conflicts that we know are coming in the future, the idea of the Sunday law, we have to go back to the old paths of the United States and the Constitution and see the principles that were laid forth, the paths themselves, and see where we went wrong and see where those we need to do as A.T. Jones said. Let me pull this back into it. We need to do as he said when James Madison actually said, when he says they saw the consequence in the principle. We need to see the consequence in the principle. When we see the principles that are set forth here in the Constitution and its conception, we can actually see the consequence, when we see the principles, we can understand the consequence of where we should be going. We can extrapolate into the future. So we're going to end there. And where I want to go from here, tomorrow what we'll do is we're going to look at the papacy for a minute, and we're going to identify some of the principles seen in their history that are in opposition to what's going on here, most of which we already know, but we're going to use some references for this. And we're going to see how the line of the papacy actually fits onto here as well. And you can see that. So, would you kneel with me in a word of prayer? Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for this time, for this first day of camp meeting. We ask that you would continue to bless the rest of the meetings, that you would bless all those who have dedicated their time to be here, that you would bless all those who have dedicated their time to serve others here, Lord, in the organization of this meeting. And we pray that you would put a hedge about us, that we would see your truth, that you would guide us, Lord, that we would be safe from the problems from without, Lord, and the distractions. And we pray that your will and your presence would be with us, Lord, and we ask for your guidance now. In Jesus' name, amen.